I'm going to go into Fareed Zakaria's opening statement this week on his show because he said some things that I just cannot let stand, or at least go unanswered. So I'm going to roll a part of it and respond to it in sequence. Here's part one.
Hamas's terrorist attacks against Israel and Israel's military actions in Gaza have unleashed a firestorm of controversy in the United States and Europe. Watching it all, I do wonder, does anyone believe in free speech anymore?
Right there. Does anyone believe in free speech anymore? That is, my first instinct is, well, the extreme left would silence and shame and isolate you and make you feel terribly for doing that, for saying whatever it is that is not in agreement with the extreme left. Again, my instinctive reaction based off of personal experience, but as well as observation from what's around me. Roll it.
Now, to note, I have strongly condemned the attacks of October 7th, and I think those that praise Hamas in any way are blind to the reality that it has been the principal opponent of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question. But the question to grapple with is how to handle views that either side finds deeply offensive.
To me, it's very simple. You let all sides speak. You don't let any side hurt physically. You let all sides speak. Very simple.
And of course, speech and assembly are not the same as physical intimidation and harassment, which prevent civil discourse. Until very recently, most concerns about free speech on college campuses were related to conservative speakers, from Ben Shapiro to Condoleezza Rice, being protested or disinvited. Conservative state legislators introduced dozens of laws to protect campus free speech. In 2021, House Republicans started a campus free speech caucus to protect free expression and free association. In January 2021, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said the most important legislative issue to get right in the next couple of years was the protection of controversial speech. Not anymore. Late last month, DeSantis reversed course, directing Florida State University's chancellor to close down campus chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine. DeSantis accused the group of giving material support to terrorism, though as far as I can tell, these groups have only organized protests and rallies.
I'm pretty skeptical of what that means. I respect Fareed's journalism, I really do. But as far as I can tell, doesn't do it. There has to be a more inquisitive and substantive investigation and substantiation to what he's saying. As far as I can tell, it was just protests. I believe him, but there needs to be more substance there for him to contest that DeSantis really believes that they're not conspiring with Hamas. They're probably not, but the journalistic bar, I think, has to be a little higher there for respect of his viewers.
As the GOP presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy has pointed out, courts have made clear that verbal support for extremist groups is very different and constitutionally protected from sending money, material, or arms. Other conservatives have tried to publicly identify and shame students belonging to groups that voice support for Hamas. A hedge fund manager proposed circulating lists of these students to ensure that they don't get jobs.
There is nothing wrong with that. There is something wrong with, let's just say, the NYU letter that came out. I'll include a copy here, or a link in the description below to the full version of it. That student signed off without including her name, probably because they didn't want to be what is known as doxxed. Doxxed is exposing private information so that people don't get jobs or they're shamed in their future endeavors, be it professional or educational. But this is public. And that's something called transparency and honesty, a point that Alan Dershowitz makes on his show. If you're making a public statement, stand by it. And yes, if this particular person wants to use his resources to circulate that, power to him. Let the marketplace of ideas, pun is not exactly intended, figure that out. If that person is going to call for the support of Hamas and say that the 10/7 attacks was Israel's fault, Let the professional world determine whether or not they want to employ a person that thinks this way. Roll it.
Many donors have demanded that universities issue statements either condemning Hamas or supporting Israel, some even insisting that certain rallies and speakers be banned. Many college presidents issued follow-up statements when their original responses were not seen as sufficiently strong in their support of Israel or denunciation of Hamas. This is all a far cry from where universities used to be.
Stop the war in Vietnam!
In 1967, in the midst of the passions of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, a report by a University of Chicago committee chaired by the eminent legal scholar Harry Calvin eloquently argued that the mission of the university could not be fulfilled if the institution formally took positions on controversial political issues of the day. The committee wrote, "A university, if it's to be true to its faith in intellectual inquiry, must embrace, be hospitable to, and encourage the widest diversity of views within its own community. It is a community, but only for the limited, albeit great purposes of teaching and research. It is not a club, it is not a trade association, it is not a lobby. Simply put, the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic."
On this point, Alan Dershowitz was actually on a libertarian podcast where they questioned him on this point, and he had involvement in this doctrine. But the school did go forth and put out a statement against the now what we know is a murder of George Floyd. Why were they able to have a reckoning around that? And over here, the doctrine seems to be, yeah, but. No, there's no but. You took a position. You threw that doctrine out. Here's a clip from that podcast.
Hello, Alan. I wonder what you think of a consistent application of the University of Chicago's Calvin Institutional Neutrality Principle. I say consistent. The University of Chicago in the 1960s, when Leo Strauss and a dozen other faculty wanted the dean of the college to cancel an invitation extended to Lincoln Rockwell to speak at a dormitory, refused to do it. They have been particular. I mean, this is like Skokie. And right from the beginning, William Rainey Harper announced in 1900 that the university as such will never be a disputant on either side of a public question, and that individual faculty are free to take any position they want, but it should be understood as their personal position. And we've stuck with that almost consistently. And I'm wondering how you feel about that as a policy for institutions. As Calvin said, the institution is the sponsor of critic. It is not itself the critic. Okay?
I completely agree. I have to tell you, Harry Calvin, who I knew, consulted with me and others on these issues, and Jeffrey Stone, who carried it forward in some ways. I am a 100% supporter of the Calvin approach, but Harvard, as Larry Summers said, forfeited its ability to take that approach by taking such strong views. Now,
I understand where you're going, but let me say that it seems to me you're renouncing it to this extent. Once you say there is no other side to this story, you are basically removing a premise of the Calvin principle, which is that there is dispute and there are two sides of a story.
No,
and we want to.
I don't agree with that. I think there's no other side, but that no side should be represented as well. People have the right to represent a point of view that has no credibility whatsoever. My friend Monroe Friedman used to give a lecture every year at his university on why the earth is flat. And he would set out rules of evidence, and he was brilliant. And he could prove through, sophistry that the earth is flat. For me, the hardest question was presented to me by Stephen Jay Gould, my dear friend who I taught with for many years. Stephen Jay Gould called me one day and said, I have a student who is the most brilliant applicant for our graduate program in evolutionary biology, except he believes that God created the earth 5,774 years ago, and you can't shake him from that belief. Should I admit him? And I said, absolutely, and I want to have dinner with him immediately. And he did admit him. Now, I'm a 100% supporter of the university. Now, here's the one problem. Does that include, for example, affirmative action at the university? It doesn't, because the exclusion that Chicago has allowed is the school can take positions on issues that affect it directly. And the line, I'm not sure, maybe you can tell me the answer to this. Did the University of Chicago sign on to the amicus brief in the affirmative action case demanding that.
They did, and in my view, it was a violation of Calvin.
Okay, so you and I are on the same side. I think if you're going to have the Calvin principle, you cannot comment on the killing of George Floyd. You cannot comment on affirmative action. You cannot comment on Nazis marching through Skokie. It has to be Caesar's wife. You have to lean over backwards to make sure you are the forum. You are not, you are Walter Cronkite. Of course, Walter Cronkite couldn't get a job today in the media, but I agree with you. If you could have a University of Chicago principle actually 100% enforced, that's the principle that I would completely support.
Back to my video. We're going to go right back into Fareed's ending, and I'll have a commentary after.
The basic argument for free speech espoused by the Calvin Report is that it is better to hear those you violently disagree with than to ban them or silence them. That way, debate happens out in the open, points are matched with counterpoints. The alternative is to drive discourse into the shadows and gutters of political life, where it festers, turns into conspiracy theories, and often erupts into violence.
Now, on that point, wouldn't we argue that that's what happened on the right, the extreme right? In the backdrop of COVID in 2020 and the festering of these extremist groups, people just got siloed up into their own bubbles, culminated in January 6th. I mean, these people had discords. These people had lines of communication that they were intertwined with, and they were just festering among themselves. And dare I say, because they couldn't voice their speech because of the suppression of the extreme left. Is that a good parallel? My instinctive thoughts. Let me know what you think below. But let's finish this up.
Growing up in India, I read with wonder about the United States' commitment to freedom of speech, which was so strong that in 1977, a court ruled that a group of Nazis should be allowed to march in Skokie, Illinois, a Chicago suburb. In the 1970s, the Harvard Crimson ran editorials praising Pol Pot's takeover in Cambodia. I went to college in the early 80s, an era in which it was not unusual to hear incendiary views on campus, from communist revolutionaries to the Nobel Prize-winning scientist William Shockley, who made crude arguments about the racial inferiority of black people. In this century, I recall very few colleges making official statements about the Iraq War or even the terrorist attacks of 9/11. We are now in a different world. In recent years, the pressure on universities to take political positions has grown. A turning point might have been the murder of George Floyd, when many institutions decided to demonstrate their sensitivity and issue statements. Once they took a stand on one political issue, it is perfectly understandable that they have been also asked to condemn Hamas's attack last month. But where will it end? A Pandora's box has been opened. With every major political event, university administrators will have to decide whether to condemn or support it. Will they find some standard by which they can explain why they denounced one terrorist attack or human rights abuse, but not another? I'm not sure what it signifies that many of us find the embrace of free speech outlined in the Calvin Report to be too cold in its neutrality. We want our institutions to endorse our own passions and points of view. But can they do that in a diverse society in which people disagree so strongly on so much? I fear that far from bringing us together, the path we are on will drive us further apart.
Yes, it will. And that's exactly what I said. The reckoning, the George Floyd incident, the George Floyd murder, yes, it did cause a reckoning, and that was the mistake of the universities, to start getting involved in politics like that. They shouldn't have. And they did, in his words, open a Pandora's box. A way out, I may propose, just say we condemn the Hamas attacks fully, thoroughly, and any group that materially supports Hamas will be banned from campus and dechartered. Fine. I don't think any sane person would disagree with that. Now, they could say going forward, we will adopt this principle where all speech is allowed, no matter how notorious it may be. We promote a free speech on campus environment and the civil debate of all ideas. Let that happen. What's wrong with that? And yes, on the track that we're on, the emotionally charged issues will just boil up to the administration level in college campuses. And yes, the colleges will be faced with an idea of, or pressures to acknowledge, condemn, compliment either side of a particular conflict, and they'll end up with a mess on campus. It's amazing to think that these are our institutions of higher learning, a place that's supposed to be exposing students to ideas that is just not in their regular bubble where they grew up with. I mean, it's a shame. It's a shame for our higher education system, and I hope they at least take an idea like this under advisement, where all speech can be tolerated, spoken. Let it.